the director of this film we will see, in the name of peace, John Hume, in America. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My role at this juncture is simply to summarize the story so far, because we don't have time to play the full film. And the context of the story so far is that we have John Hume entering the political realm in Derry, in Northern Ireland, first as a civil rights leader, and then as an elected representative to the Parliament of Northern Ireland. He encounters great resistance for his agenda for reform. He wishes to reform Northern Ireland. He challenges what he sees as the discriminatory apparatus that exists in that society. He demands change. And we have, at this point, the arrival of British soldiers on the streets of Northern Ireland to consolidate the efforts of the Unionist government to keep what they call law and order. So you've got this immediate clash between people from the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland, the nationalist side, who are demanding change in their society, the discrimination they see in job allocation and housing and in elections in the gerrymandered system. And on the other hand, you have what's called the security forces who are resisting this change. And we're about to start this film at a point where Hume leads a march. There's some street agitation, and ultimately he leads a march, a civil rights march in McGilligan Beach, and you see the confrontation between he and the British soldiers. So I'll just leave it there. This is a brief intro to the story so far. We'll have a discussion later on. Thanks again. Bye.
Are we all organised? Speaking as someone who wasted 20 years of his life trying to find a solution to the Vietnam War, I was particularly anxious and willing to see this film. The problem in Northern Ireland was a replica of, in miniature, you might perhaps, of the problems which have been troubling the world for a very long time. I'm very grateful to Maurice Fitzpatrick for having drawn it together in this beautiful film. The problems of how to resolve this sort of conflict, and the role by John Hume in doing so, the man in the middle, which we lacked during the Vietnam War days, unfortunately. And in particular, I'm grateful for the subtitles because they help me understand quite a bit of the language. I leave the room open to Mr. Fitzpatrick to make his comments.
Well, first up, I'd like to say thanks again for having me at this wonderful establishment. I remember well from my time living in Tokyo, coming along here for drinks for the evening time, sometimes with friends, a meal. The FCCJ was always very welcoming, and I'm grateful as well to the Irish Embassy for having co-organised this event. I'd like to recognise Tim Harrington, who's Chargé d'Affaires, and Ashleen Braden, who's Cultural Attaché, and both here today with us. I suppose I should say something about how I got involved in this story. I'm not actually from the north of Ireland. I'm not from Derry. But I got involved through making another film called The Boys of St. Columns. It was a book I wrote on a film, and I did that for the BBC while I was still living in Japan, actually. I did it for the BBC and for RTÉ, Ireland's national broadcaster. That story was focused on John Hume's school, where he went to school, what you would call a high school in Derry. And he went to that school with people like Seamus Heaney, quite an illustrious group of people who came through St. Colum's at a particular time in the 50s into the 60s. And they were all beneficiaries of an opening up of education in Northern Ireland on a meritocratic basis, basically mass education. Once you passed an academic test, you could get into a secondary school like St. Colum's and then progress from there into university. So I see Hume as very much representative of that new crop of people who whose parents didn't have a chance to go to secondary school and university, and suddenly this generation begins to challenge its society, challenge the political and social structures of the society and demand change. The type of change you heard during the film came on a social level, yes, and a political level. And then Hume, because he was foiled in many of the initiatives he took, he saw that he needed to internationalize this question and bring to bear this huge Irish-American influence, which was focused on Washington, D.C., people like Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy you learned of in this film. There's a sort of a side story there, a subtext. That generation of Americans were, if you follow the progress of someone like Tip O'Neill, grandfather coming to the United States and laboring, and then father becoming involved in trade unionism, and then he himself becoming formally involved in city politics first, and then becoming Speaker of the House of Representatives. So you have a progression there, a social progression. And he, as you can well imagine, had a very, very strong relationship with John Hume, also because they had that simple basis to empathize with each other. They understood what it was to have been marginalized in their own societies, and particularly that was the case with John Hume. So that's how my journey towards this story, and it's been a very rewarding one. I'd very much welcome your comments or questions, or if you'd like to ask me something.
Yes, do we have any questions? Please, Tokumoto-san.
My name is Tokumoto Freelance, and thank you very much for very enlightening and entertaining movie today. I am not familiar with the detailed history of Ireland, but when I visited Belfast, I remember when I visited a local pub, there was a message, no shooting, not no smoking. And my question is, I think that somebody in the movie raised this question. Do you think we can have the same process in other parts of the world, particularly in Korean Peninsula right now? Because I think that at the end of the movie, I think one gentleman said the key factor is education. And education will encourage you to get away from the emotional argument. But in North Korea, I don't know if they have the education at the local schools. So do you think we can achieve the same process in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia?
Thanks very much for your question. Yeah, that was Robert Fisk, the great journalist, who made that point that if you had to extract some area of commonality between Northern Ireland and other troubled zones, he was referring to troubled zones like the Balkans and the Middle East. North Korea it's a very peculiar set of circumstances whereby there's almost total censorship, and to envisage an open educational system, it was very difficult for me to envisage it. And yet so many other parts of the world have come through a comparable enough degree of repression. I think the answer is yes, it can happen, it will happen, and it needs to happen. Now, whether it will happen tomorrow morning and what exactly will be the triggering force remains to be seen. I think it falls on the international community to be as supportive as possible and that means certainly a support of Washington. That isn't what we have now, so currently I'm not hugely optimistic.
Any other questions? Well, I have one. I mean, this is a very beautiful film, and I know as a former journalist how much effort is involved in trying to get people in front of the camera and pull it all together. The enormous amount of time and effort goes into it. This, it seems to me, would go very well on Netflix. Have you made an approach to them?
I'm in the midst
Without
of,
that, you won't get the publicity that you deserve.
Netflix is, well, I'm in the midst of dialogue with a distributor and at the moment, and that's a North American-based distributor, so that entity may well in turn sell the film to Netflix. Most filmmakers, and I am no different, want exposure of their film. They want people to see it and to discuss it. That's where I stand anyway. And there was a period when Netflix focused in a great deal on political and historical documentaries, and we're not in that period just now. I know from speaking to people that there's much more focus on pop culture, but that will change again. You know, the BBCs of this world, the PBSs in the United States, there are obvious outlets for it, and I'm, you know, as I say, very supportive of that. And I'm just back from Australia. It occurs to me, you know, ABC may well be interested with the level of Irish diaspora, but I think it's also a film for people who've got no clear involvement with Ireland as yet. It's something that they can get something from.
Well, I think you're a little pessimistic, but anyway. Do we have any other comments or questions? Please.
Maurice, my name is Thomas Sullivan. I'm from Ireland. I was brought up in the country during the Troubles, so I'm absolutely delighted that you have made this movie about John Hume. He was a tremendous character. I remember it back 30, 40 years. But I heard one of the speakers here, or one of your film participants, comparing him to Parnell or Daniel O'Connell. I mean, on the international scene, who would you compare him to in terms of what he's achieved in Northern Ireland?
Thank you very much for your comments, Tom. I've written a book on this subject, and I did ponder and I did make a couple of claims in that book about comparable figures to John Hume, or just ways in which he behaved in a comparable way, say to Mahatma Gandhi in his dealing with the British Parliament. And Bill Clinton makes this claim right at the start of the film that he was the Irish conflict's Martin Luther King. And I go along with that certainly in this respect. King was extremely adept at being able to marshal the momentum that he built and led on the street, the Selma to Montgomery March being a classic example, to bring the discussion to the highest level of negotiation with the Oval Office, LBJ, you know, telling them, listen, give us more time here, we're working on a civil rights bill, it's not easy, and so on. And King says, no, we want it now. Hume was very like that. If you read his, particularly his speeches when he was elected to the Parliament of Northern Ireland between 69 and 72, he was very, very explicit in his demands and very unrelenting and very impatient about achieving them, because, you know, he forewarned where Northern Ireland was going. He urged the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, stop it now. This momentum is not going away. You need to accede to certain demands. You need to form a new society. So those speeches, those stances he took in those early days ring down the years. And so I do think of him in those terms, Gandhi, and in the international scene, and King. And that's putting him on a high pedestal, but that's the way I see it.
Any other comments? Yes, please.
Dean Harrington. Very good film. Thank you very much. We may have met before, actually. Considering what happened in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and Britain, we now have a new situation facing us, which has to do with Brexit, how that's going to affect Ireland, and actually what may or may not happen with the European Union in general. So perhaps you might put in your crystal ball and sort of see where that might go. Thank you.
I left my crystal ball back in Ireland. Thanks, Dean, for the question. It's true that Brexit has very, very considerably altered the situation. Just in the last 24 hours, we've had 4 of the 5 major parties in Northern Ireland co-sign a statement to demand the most minimum disturbance, to demand assurance from the British government that the arrangements we have in Northern Ireland today will be protected irrespective of what outcome will come with Brexit. The exception being the party that didn't sign that statement was the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, which happens to be the biggest party in terms of its electoral support. And it also happens to be the party that has influence in London. I'm saying the only entity in London that influences things, because the SDLP, being the other nationalist party, lost its seats last time, and Sinn Féin doesn't take its seats in London. So, moreover, Theresa May requires DUP support to sustain government. So they've got absolute power there. And the fact that they're not signed up to this just tells you a lot about where we stand right now. They are a very destructive force for protection of the Good Friday Agreement, which, let's remember, took many, many years of hard negotiation. Let's also remember it's more than one agreement, it's 2 agreements, and it's agreement between the Irish government and the British government. That's one of the agreements signed Good Friday, and the other one being a multi-party agreement. And any student of Northern Irish politics knows quite how long that took to get all sides sitting down, and it's something that we do need to protect. But whatever about Brexit being a long-term, having long-term consequences, what is certain is that the DUP and Tory coalition in all but name will not survive. Just government numbers being what they are, that's a transitory thing. And I do think it has really severely undercut the trust that was required to sustain an assembly in Belfast. At time of speaking, we haven't had an assembly in Belfast since last January, and there's very, very little prospect of a sustained assembly until Britain gets its shop in order, and that's anyone's guess how that's going to work. We've got big negotiations next month in Europe. It doesn't seem to me that they're at all prepared. And really, Brexit is it's very hard to know how it will go, and it's hard to envisage a good outcome for the British, and therefore there will be a political price to pay in the north of Ireland as well. So really, really troubling times.
Well, I think our time is up. If I've just one very brief question. You're in America all the time. Doesn't anybody talk to you about the Civil War in America in the context of North Ireland?
Well, I always joke that the Americans sent us special envoys. It's time for us to start sending the special envoys over there. What also bubbles up in conversations in America is how could this happen again? If HUME was on the go now and the troubles were as they were, say, in 75 or 72, could you have a coalition in Congress that would put this on the table in the White House? It's very hard to imagine that, because there's so little cooperation between the parties, between the houses in Congress, between Congress and the White House. All of those stars aligned, at least on the Ireland question, aligned very considerably. And I'll finish on this. I had a screening in the United States Congress last September, and my hosts, the Irish Embassy was involved, but also 2 congressmen, one a Republican and the other a Democrat. And it seemed to me so poignant to have a screening in those circumstances, because surely it was one of the very few moments of bipartisanship in Washington. It's true that to this day, yes, people like Brendan Boyle, Brian Fitzpatrick, Pennsylvanian congressmen can get together on Irish issues, but the kind of rapport and the kind of tangible progress you had between Speaker O'Neill and President Reagan, that's very hard to imagine in these days.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.